Recently, the Society for Vascular Surgery decided to sponsor an audio-video archive of interviews with those who have contributed to vascular surgery. Jimmy Yao is our chairman of a working historical interview committee, and today we have the privilege and pleasure of interviewing Dr. Ben Eiseman, professor, admiral, with whom I have had exchanges for the past 45 years. Also, William Pierce will help with the interviews, and we will make a change, and we're very pleased to have Jerry Rainier and hopefully Jim Chandler with us, who can also contribute to the interview. So Dr. Eiseman, we really appreciate your willingness to be interviewed for the Society for Vascular Surgery for these historical notes. And let's start with your early years, if you would. We know you were born 95 years ago in St. Louis, Missouri. Please tell us a little bit about your parents and what led you to medicine.
Well, Norm, I was, as you say, born in St. Louis. My family, my father's family came to St. Louis just before the Civil War. My great-great-grandfather served in a supportive supply type to General Grant when during his campaign. My other side of my family came up from New Orleans, and they were on the South in the Civil War. And I was brought up in St. Louis, where my parents were able to send me to good schools. And the important part of it was they gave me the inevitable responsibilities of having been furnished good education.
Were there any doctors in your family?
There were no doctors in my family up until about a generation before mine, and then they began to be doctors. These 3 generations before my mother and my father came to America were all young fellows in their teens when they came.
Being from the Midwest, how did you end up at Yale?
Well, that's an interesting story, because my father went to Yale. And in the days, he graduated in '01 from Yale. And it was a rarity to have Midwesterners go to Yale. But then my mother's family from New Orleans also were Yale. So that I grew up as a youngster, well, of course I was going to go to Yale, and that was accepted. But it was also accepted that I was going to make good grades to get there. And there was no compromise on that. So that I think this was important in my own background. I have my mother, my father, my ancestors looking over my shoulder to be sure that I was going to work hard, I was going to get good grades, I was going to get good education, and I was going to be successful, if you will.
You must have known the Whiff and Poof song before you got there.
Oh, I did, and we had a lot of singing in our family. My father was sang at Yale, and I did, etc.
Well, you know, with all of that wonderful heritage, what led you to go to a rival school and go to medical school at Harvard?
Well, that's an interesting story. I actually at Yale was going to go into foreign service, and I only took enough science in case I wanted to go into medicine. And I went into medicine. I was interviewed at Harvard, because I looked at Harvard as probably I applied at 3 different schools, at Yale, Harvard, and Philadelphia, and PNS 4. And I went to Harvard and applied there, and I was interviewed there by the dean. The dean interviewed the finals, and he asked me, how did you get here? And I said, well, I came up from Central America to get for the interview. And he said, well, what were you doing down there? And I said, well, I was working on ships and plantations, and he interviewed me for a half an hour, and I talked to him about the Indians that I'd worked with in Central America at the time. And then at the end of that, he said, "Well, thank you, Mr. Eiseman." And I thought, well, and I asked him, "Aren't you going to ask me why I want to be a doctor?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, I blew that one." And 10 days later, I was informed I got into Yale, to Harvard, to Harvard Medical School.
Oh, that's great. And you did continue your postgraduate training with your first postgraduate year, your internship at Massachusetts General Hospital.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, that came about that once again, I looked around and figured that the toughest jobs around were at the Mass General and the Brigham, and applied there. These were in the early war years. And there was no question in my generation, it wasn't the fine generation, it was just understood that in this unique class, unique temper time, we were all going to join up and go to war. And so I applied to the Massachusetts General, which was about as tough as you could get. Sure. And was accepted there, and we were given only 9 months of internship, and then off to war we went.
Did you know at that time you wanted to be a surgeon?
At that time, I probably wanted to be more either a surgeon, or since I'd spent a lot of time, a number of summers in the tropics, tropical medicine. But by the time I got into service, I wanted to be a surgeon. My mentors, which I even knew Harvey Cushing as a young fellow, and he was, of course, retired. But they all had had experience in World War I.
Surely.
And those were my role models. And I knew I was going to go into service. And since I'd worked on ships, commercial ships, I went into the Navy. I knew I was going to go to war, and they took us in after 9 months of internship. And 6 days after I put a uniform on, I was at sea on a landing craft in charge of a beach battalion. I didn't even know how to salute, except like a Boy Scout with 3 fingers. And in retrospect, I don't think that held me back at all, that I didn't have preliminary indoctrination into the military. And then I went off to war, and we ended up on Normandy.
How long had you been in the Navy before you got to Normandy?
I'd been in 4 months.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
Well, but Norm, we had nothing. We were really morale officers.
Right.
We went in on the assault wave, and all we had were morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, and bandages. And as our instructors told us, there's nothing you can do except first aid on the beach. And all the indoctrination in the world wouldn't have made any difference. And as a matter of fact, one of our instructors was a fellow named Zollinger, and who became a dear friend. And he indicated, he said, "Fellows, I'm glad I'm not going to be with you," but he said, "You're going to be on your own and just plain use common sense."
Sure.
And that's all we could do, and there was do first aid.
You did remain several more years during World War II in the Navy. What other challenges did you have in World War II other than Normandy?
Well, then I was switched over from the European theater, still in the amphibious forces, which was the lowest of the low and medically. We were actually the equivalent of first lieutenants. We weren't even captains. And that's about how much surgery we knew, too, of a first lieutenant, Lieutenant J.G. But I was then assigned out in the Pacific into Palau and in the Philippines campaign, and then in Okinawa with the Marines. and then again was switched over to the Mediterranean, to Cairo, where there was a lot of unrest going on there at the time. So I was switched back and forth for theaters.
With no jet aircraft in those days, how did you travel from the Atlantic to the Pacific and then back to the Mediterranean?
Well, on landing craft that drew 4 to 5 feet of water, flat bottom, and at top speed would be 10 knots.
Through the Panama Canal both ways?
Through the Panama Canal.
Yeah,
Sure.
no, that's a fantastic experience.
Well, in retrospect, and I was a young fellow, it was an experience.
At the end of the war, you had some positive experiences and you wanted to stay in the military. Did you join the reserve at that time?
I did. Quite frankly, I was scared all the time because we were always on the assault wave. But I was a young guy, and
Sure.
I enjoyed the military. And so it was quite easy to stay in the reserve at that time. So I stayed in the reserve and kept a reserve commission throughout. I went back and then became a surgeon and kept my reserve commission.
Right.
And was called to serve in the Korean War in a supportive role in what amounts to was then OSS, CIA type thing.
Why did you decide to do your surgery at Washington University in St. Louis?
Well, I was born and brought up, and all my parents and grandparents were in St. Louis. And Dr. Everett Graham, who was professor and chairman at Washington University, was chairman of the Department of Surgery at Washington University. And actually, I knew the Grahams. I grew up with Everett Graham's children. So I knew Dr. Graham as the father of some of my friends. And actually, Dr. Graham repaired my right inguinal hernia. And in retrospect, I'll bet you he hadn't done a hernia in 20 years. But he had, everybody that helped him were professors to be.
Right. Yeah.
And the heritage I got from him, I think, is still important. And that is, if you're going to be in academic surgery, the best thing you can do is train future academic surgeons.
Right.
And that environment that he brought us up in made an impression on me. And I said, this is what I want to do in surgery. I want to train professors.
When you finished your training, you ended up in Colorado. And how did that come about?
Well, that's a long story, and we don't have time for it. But when I was a young guy, I did a lot of foolish things. But at the age of 16, I got a job out in Casper, Wyoming, being an irrigator and pitching hay. And I fell in love with the West then. And actually, my first quarter at Yale, I came back at Christmas time and told my mother and father that I wanted to drop out of Yale and become a cowboy. And my mother and father almost went into shock. And my mother gave me a good bit of advice. She said, listen, okay, if you want to go out and be a cowboy, fine, but you're going to finish, you started at Yale, and you're going to finish this year. At the end of that time, if you still want to be a cowboy, you can do it. Well, by June, I decided I wanted to be a doctor.
You know, from all of these positive experiences, why would you move to Kentucky and take a job to start a new department of surgery in 1961?
Well, I had chosen surgery, of course, because of my experience and interest in it. And academic surgery was a part of it. And if there is a theme to my professional life, it is that I was of the generation that lived in the golden era of surgery and in the golden era of academic surgery, when there was money to support teaching. Right. There was United States America was preeminent in world surgery, And I knew I wanted to be a chairman of surgery. Almost everybody in my medical school department, it was understood we were going to be professor and chairman.
Yeah.
It was just whether you were going to be a surgeon or a psychiatrist or dermatologist or whatever. So when an opportunity arose in starting a new school in Kentucky, they came to me and said, would you build a new department of surgery in a new school in Lexington, Kentucky?
Well, and you did for some of the young people with you what Dr. Graham had done for you. You provided mentorship for Ben Rush and Frank Spencer and a number of other people. Talk a little bit about that era in your life.
Well, I had decided, I knew I was going to be a chairman somewhere. So I had kept my eye out nationally and internationally that when I took over a department, I was going to choose, you see, there was nobody there, so I had carte blanche, that I was going to choose future chairman. And so I spotted one who was from Johns Hopkins, turned out to be Frank Spencer, who became professor and chairman at NYU. Ben Rush. Took him, he became chairman at New Jersey. And so on down the line. So that the first 7 people I chose to come to me in Lexington all became chairman within 7 years. And 3 or 4 subsequently became chairman of surgery and professors of surgery throughout the country. And that was the most fulfilling, probably the most fulfilling period of my life, when I surrounded myself with my own selectees, every one of whom was to be a future chairman. And I hired them with that in mind. Yeah. I said, look, you're going to be with me for a while, and then you're going to be a chairman. And 10 of my appointees became chairman of surgery somewhere else.
Yeah. No, fantastic. You know, with that experience, what brought you back to Colorado?
Well, that's a long and interesting story, but it's easily explained by the fact that I love the West. I love the mountains. By that time, I'd started climbing mountains around the world, and I'd traveled all around the world, and I decided I wanted to come to Colorado, where I was surrounded by people who also loved the outdoors. And in essence, I came back to Denver and had the opportunity to work with another remarkable guy by the name of Henry Swan.
Sure. Dr.
Swan was chairman here, and he said, Ben, you come out to Denver and take over the Denver VA hospital, and we'll make it a part of the university. It was separate. And so I took it, and it was a gamble, but working with Henry, it paid off. And I once again had an opportunity to hire people, and I hired people like a young fellow named W.G. Rayner, Jerry Rayner, who came to me, asked me to interview him for a job. He had just been serving as a battalion surgeon in Korea, and he said, do you mind if I bring my wife along with me during the interview? I thought that was a little bit odd. So they sat there, Jerry and Lois, his wife, holding hands while I interviewed him for a job. And I thought, well, you know, any guy would be like that. I often said later to Jerry, I hired Jerry because of his wife more than he, but I hired people like Jerry Rayner to come along and be my associates there. And once again, academically, that proved to have produced a brand of brothers who were remarkably professionally productive in the field of surgical research.
You know, you mentioned the mountains. You once told me I was the only person you visited who didn't have a mountain to climb, so I've always felt very honored. You've made many of your professorships around the world combined with climbing mountains. Tell us a little bit about the mountains you've climbed.
Well, I've climbed I've climbed a lot of mountains around the world. First of all, there are 54 peaks in Colorado, 14,000 or more, and I'd climbed all those, many of them several times. And I used to take the nurses and the medical students and the students and one thing and another and climb mountains during the summer. That was part of being our residency, to climb mountains together. And I've climbed, then I had friends around the country who also were in surgery, with whom I'd climbed mountains and skied, and cross-country skied, all the way from medical school on, most notable of which of Dr. Henry Bonson.
Yes.
Hank Bonson, who became well known at Hopkins and then professor chairman at Pittsburgh. And Hank Bonson and I climbed mountains together during our vacations for years. And we would hike together. But you must understand, I have climbed many mountains, but to climb Everest, for example, and I've climbed on Everest 3 times, and I've climbed on K2 twice, both from Pakistan and China. But I am not a world-class climber. To climb those 8,000-meter peaks, you have to devote 4 months of your life, and I couldn't do that.
Right.
So I've climbed a lot of mountains all over the world and made friends climbing mountains in every country, because I would subsequently say, yes, I'll come and be your visiting professor, but you have to lay on a climb on the highest mountain in your country.
Yeah.
And they'd say, oh, well, you don't want to climb this. It's only 4,000, 5,000 feet, and it's out in the middle of a jungle. I'd say, well, that's fine. So they would lay on a trip, and we'd climb the mountain. And so I've climbed the highest mountains in a lot of countries, and made many close friends. I would usually drag the professor of surgery along with me. So I made many friends that way.
Well, among your friends were William Gore and Robert McNamara. Please comment on your friendships with them.
Well, Bill Gore is who subsequently named the product he made, Gore-Tex, was also a skier. And he and his wife, and my wife Mary and I, hired a cabin together, rented a cabin together in Vail one spring. And I'd been working in vascular surgery, and I had done some research in various kinds of substances for prosthetics, for venous conduits and arterial conduits. And after skiing one afternoon, we went down for drinks, and Bill Gore had a gray tie on like that, and he said, "Feel this," and I felt it was very silky, a very sexy feeling thing. And I said, "What is this thing?" And he said, "Look." He took his tie out like that, and he poured some mustard on it, like this. And we hadn't had a lot of drinks, and he said, "Now watch," and he washed it off. And I said, "Gee, what is that stuff, Bill?" And he said, "Well, we call it Gore-Tex." He said, I knew Bill had worked in Cleveland and had a patent, he said, on this expanded Teflon. And he said, it's an expanded Teflon, and we use it. He said, "Look," and he took out a piece of cloth out of his pocket like this. He said, "You hold up one side of it like this and this side," and he lit a match, and he could blow the match out through the cloth. And then he took the cloth and he cupped it like this, and he poured water in it, and it held water, and he dumped it out. And I said, "Well, Bill, that's an interesting material, that Gore-Tex." I said, "Could you make it into an oxygenator?" And he said, "Well, what do you want to oxygenate?" And I said, "Well, blood." we're in the era of trying to make better membrane oxygenators. And I said, could you make it into a tube? He said, yes, we make tubes anyway of this for these new businesses called computers. Little tiny tubes, we could make them bigger. I said, could you make them big enough to be used as a prosthetic in states to replace arteries or veins? He said, sure, we make it down at Flagstaff, Arizona, and I'll just tell our guy down there to make it your size. So by that time I was in Denver, and we had the laboratories at the university and the animals. And so he made it in sizes. At first the pore size was so big that the blood went through it, and then it was so small that the oxygen didn't come through, and so he altered the pore size. And we then, with the fantastic group of young guys I had working with me at the time, we tried it in all sorts of animals and all sorts of arteries and veins, and we decided we could use it to substitute for veins. By that time, others, many others, had various substances for arterial substitutes, but we didn't really have a good venous substitute. But we had used this tube in a number of dogs to replace the portal vein. And then Larry Norton, who was one of our band of brothers there, ran across a patient that we were looking for who had a carcinoma cancer of the portal that invaded the portal vein, but had not had spread. He called me. I was out at the university hospital. I said, okay, let's get one. I called Becky, our technician. I said, boil up a 9mm Gore-Tex graft, and I'll pick it up and we'll take it down to the Denver General. And we replaced the portal vein where the cancer had invaded the portal vein as a substitute, and took the portal vein with the cancer invasion out and used as a substitute. The elderly lady that we put it into survived for 4 years and died of a heart attack, and that was the first use of Gore-Tex in humans.
Well, a monumental contribution that is recognized today, as we know. And when Bill Pierce takes over in a few minutes, he's going to go through a few more of your contributions. But let me ask you, among all of the accolades that you've had in your life, the accomplishments, is there anything that stands out as being most satisfying to you?
Most satisfying, no question. The most satisfying accolade, or not accolade, this comes from within, not from without, is the satisfaction of having had a part in the training, education, friendship, and creating the period of trying to improve things of the young people that I had come along. I was fortunate to be in that era when external forces were perfect to bring young people in, and we were flooded with bright young people, and to have had even a little bit in the stimulation of training physicians of all kinds, but particularly surgeons, in academic surgery is the greatest satisfaction to me in my 94, 95-year-old.
When I once said to you some 40 years ago, I could never repay you for what you did for me, you said, yes, you can. Look behind you and put out your hand to help those coming along behind you. Very good advice, Ben, and you certainly learned that.
But you, Norm, epitomize what is satisfactory to me, and Bill Pierce epitomizes it. You succeeded in doing what you did professionally for the military medicine. You epitomize the best of military medicine, as Bill Pierce and Jerry Rayner, who went into practice, epitomize what you can do And if I had a little bit in stimulating all three of you and the hundreds of others that I had, that's the satisfaction of a 94, 95-year-old guy whose life was in academic surgery.
We're very proud of the legacy that you've left at the Uniformed Services University, your only federal medical school. And as you know, the Ben Eiseman Professorship Awards that you established in 1986 will go on in perpetuity to do just what you've advocated, and that's helping the younger people. So we really appreciate that.
Well, finally, I feel an old person looks to the future much more than he looks to the past. It's an anachronism, but it's true. But I feel it's important for those of us, those in the future, who are going to be academic surgeons, should feel a sense of civic responsibility, many civic responsibilities, one of which is to support the military medical departments, because predictably in the future, the country is going to need people like you and others who've continued in military medicine. But you have to make a continuum of academic surgeons who continue to have interest in military surgery.
Let me turn this over at this point to Bill Pearson. Would you bring out your piece of paper that you wrote those accomplishments out of? And I've already told Bill that you have a list of accomplishments that you read to us last night, which is overwhelming, and I think it even surprised you. So Bill, please come and take the hot seat here. And
Good morning, Dr. Eiseman.
Good morning, Bill.
My name is Bill Pierce. I'm a member of the Society for Vascular Surgery. And Jim Yao has established this program to interview many of our distinguished members. And Dr. Eiseman, I have a great honor to do this today as being one of your trainees and look to you with great esteem. I looked at your CV, and it's compact. It's full of many lives of many people. And you have more than 450 publications. And what jumps out is a person who's so intellectually curious. Now, tell me, where did that curiosity come from?
Well, curiosity, it's hard to say, but obviously I was brought up to be curious and to be productive and with a sense of responsibility that if to whom much is given, much is expected. And I was fortunate enough to have had much given to me, an opportunity to go to schools that challenged me. My mother and father started a school in St. Louis, two schools, one a preliminary school and another a high school, both of which challenged us, one community school in St. Louis, the other John Burroughs School, in which we were challenged to think out of the box and think into the future, to provide ideas and leadership for society. And that was a part of the training for me, my sisters and brother, etc.
Many of your publications are basic science on livers and oxygenation and bubble oxygenators and cardiac surgery, many papers in vascular surgery, and many papers in military medicine and planning. What do you think are your biggest contributions in those areas?
Well, let me start, because really this is supposed to be about vascular surgery. I was confounded when by the honor of being considered as a pioneer in vascular surgery. I knew I'd had a wide experience in this era, and I thought, my gosh, what have I really done in vascular surgery? So I looked up in my CV and my curriculum vitae, and I listed some of the things that we published about. And I won't take you through this, there are about 20 items. But this was the era when we started, when there was no good prosthetic material to replace a vessel. We took, originally we took pieces of this new stuff called plastic from a sponge in this is when Jerry Rayner was a resident, and we took the pieces and we put them in the autoclave and fused them, and we used that as an aorta to replace an aortic valve, the abdominal aorta. We then had a wooden mandrel that we placed the plastic material over the wooden mandrel, and we had actually Jerry Rayner's wife Lois sew that valve. We put those in. We actually put some of those in patients who had aortic aneurysms that were about to burst. This was long before the requirements for screening and numbers of patients and clearance is concerned. It was a period when we had no way to visualize the aorta. And that time we were exploring the idea, the presence of thoracic aortic aneurysms. And we were among the first to show that in blunt trauma you could sometimes get the swinging forth of the aorta like this beneath the left subclavian vein, and you could have an aneurysm develop there. We incidentally, after seeing some of these, we once operated on a patient who had fallen out of a tree, as I remembered, and hit his chest, who developed a hematoma around his thoracic aorta, and there was a lot of hematoma there. We explored him. There was no aneurysm, but 3 weeks later, an aneurysm developed, and we had to go in and replace it. This was an era when there was no way of visualizing the ascending aorta, and so we took spinal needles from the Denver VA and stuck the spinal needle in through the right subclavian space to the base of the aorta, and there was no mechanism to take rapid films. We had a 50 cc syringe loaded with dye, and we pushed hard on the patient who was lying there under no anesthesia except local in the neck. And you'd push like this, and we had the students and the residents lined up with cassettes like this, and they'd run in and they'd shove the cassette in like this, and then we'd say, shoot, and they'd shoot the film, and then they'd push it out, and another team would take it out and put another one in, shoot, another one, shoot. So I turned that, after doing several of them, my young, brash chief resident, Rayner, said, look, I'd like to do this one. And so he did this. He stuck it. I was looking over his shoulder like this through the X-ray fluoroscope. He stuck the needle down, looked like it was in the right place, and he pushed hard on the syringe, and the dye went into his coronary artery. And I said, Jesus Christ, you killed him. Because the dye went into his coronary arteries, I thought certainly in that period that would make him fibrillate and die. Well, Jerry Rayner, typical Jerry, he's kept that slide of that X-ray of the coronary artery, and as far as it actually wasn't the first time it had ever been catheterized. But I said, Jerry, you're fired. And he often brings that out and says, I'm the only guy who got fired for taking the first coronary angiogram. But it shows the era. But we went through and we had the atmosphere of, if we ran across a problem of a place that we weren't doing well in vascular surgery, we would try it in animals to see if we could improve it. We did H grafts instead of doing portocable shunts. We grafted from the portal vein to the vena cava. Subsequently, my successor, a young fellow that I had a very small part, but a very proud part of bringing up, Starzl, who succeeded me at the Denver VA, who had great delight in taking the patients in whom I did H grafts and who subsequently got in trouble and he would send me patient by patient as he had to reoperate on an improvement. But we were the first to do the transient ischemic attacks, the TIAs, among the first in this country. And I picked it up actually from Charles Robb in England, and we published the first patients we did the TIAs on the carotid. We did under hypothermia because we figured we couldn't clamp the carotid artery and because of the cerebral damage. And in those days I was working with Henry Swan, under Henry Swan, who was one of my dear friends and also a mentor. And he had the spirit, well, if you find something that you want to do, and you and I together figure it's safe and it's a good bet for the patient, do it. And so we did the first TIAs, transient ischemic attacks, under hypothermia. And so I won't take you through the whole list, but I figured I was surprised to find 20-odd papers that we wrote on various vascular problems. Does that give you the...
It does. I saw your surgery on the aortoiliac system, the carotid aneurysms, the carotid endarterectomies. It's quite impressive. The venous valve that you constructed very early in your career.
Well, yes, that has some kind of interesting stories. We realized deep thrombophlebitis and venous insufficiency in various ways. Well, how can we replace it? And one idea I had by that time, for various reasons, I'd been invited to be visiting professor of surgery in Singapore. And I went there in a remarkable place even then. And we went through had to get to the third floor at the Singapore General Hospital. And that was the delivery floor. And I didn't know anything about OBGYN, but I saw these placenta there, and I said, hey, we could take a placental, an umbilical vein, and we could make an artery out of that, or a vein. So we took umbilical veins from human placenta, and we stretched them out and used them as an arterial prosthetic. It's the only paper I ever published in the Singapore Surgical Journal. And bless the fellow who subsequently looked that up and quoted that as the first use of umbilical veins. But it was that spirit that we were able to inculcate into our residents. We had a fellow named Cleve Trimble, a dear friend subsequently, who became a distinguished emergency room physician leader, who made a bridge of the left common carotid artery to where it pressed down on the left venous branch, which we thought caused venous problems, and we made the Trimble Bridge. Now there was an idea that didn't work out, so that everything we thought of, by no means everything succeeded, but it was stimulating that idea that everybody from the beginning up in this superb group of people who are chosen to be medical students, these days in particular, that these are the creme de la creme, intellectually, imaginatively, thinking out of the box, and preserve that during their training, right from the beginning. Just because you're an intern and have an idea, don't think that is a bad idea. I've got an idea right now I'm not sure is a good idea, and I bounce it off of my dear friends like Jim Chandler last night. Is this a good idea or not? But to preserve that idea of think out of the box, of ideas that can improve the surgical treatment of patients. That's a long answer to why we had 20 different projects in vascular surgery.
I think many of the people that trained with you carried that on with you. One last question. How do you think vascular surgery has changed over these last 40 years, and what do you see its future?
Well, that's two different questions. One's easy, and the other is not easy. How it's changed has been well documented by a lot of important thinkers such as yourself and Jimmy Yao and Norm Rich and many others, vascular surgeons. And this isn't the place to show how the economic dynamics of vascular surgery have changed, how the type of patients that present to us have changed, how advances in endoscopic endoscopy have changed. They have changed an era, a golden era, where vascular surgery was preeminent, and there were opportunities everywhere, to areas where vascular surgical operations are much fewer and much further, much rarer than they were in the past. And we needn't go into that. Many people, including yourself, have given this thought. But where's it going? Of course, I have, just because I'm at the end of my life doesn't mean I have any prescience. The man hasn't asked me how things are going to be. But I look at it in a positive way. I've seen orthopedics go through a dry period. I've seen orthopedics where hip fracture was dull. There was nothing we could do about it. Old people fell down, they broke their hips, we put them in traction and they died. And hip fracture was the unknown fracture, how to improve it. All of a sudden, we had methods for improving hip fracture, and orthopedics blossomed again. And I've seen the waxing and waning of surgical specialties. And let's face it, vascular surgery at the moment is in a period of waning. And it's going to take people such as you, Jimmy Yao, and the other forceful thinkers at the present to figure out where are we going. Many departments, including our own, are looking for leadership in vascular surgery. And we have to choose people who are up to date, and how are they going to put us back on a waxing period of vascular surgery. I think you're going to have to call in the help of basic scientists who now don't ask your help. You go and ask their help now. People who look down their noses at you, you're not going to help them. You get them in, you have ideas that will help them, but you're going to have to bring in help from outside the little band of brothers who are maintaining this idea, this chalice of vascular surgery. That's a long answer to a short question.
It's much appreciated. Thank you, Dr. Eiseman.
Thank you, Bill.
I'm Gerald Rayner. I have the good fortune of having been Ben Eiseman's first resident that he chose, and my son was his last. I could talk forever, and all of us could, about all of the interplay we've had with this esteemed pioneer, thinker, good friend. But I'm going to dwell on one particular issue. Ben mentioned the fact that he was told when he went to Normandy, use common sense. So I used common sense, and I was a first-year resident on pathology. He sent me 10 days trip to learn how to preserve blood vessels, homographs, and he gave me $50. I wanted to visit Barb Muller and Pauls Hershey in St. Louis and Ormond Julian in Chicago and come back with a way of doing it. So I started the vessel bank at the VA hospital, and this is a thoracic abdominal aorta that was preserved in 1956. Call it lyophilized, crowd desiccated, whatever you want to call it, and it's served in vacuum tube. But this is representative of the way Ben Eiseman thinks. Ben, I can't think of anything but good things to say about you and what you've done for maybe 2 or 3 generations of us now, and we're very appreciative for it. What have I done that has garnered any kind of respect from you for trying to carry on your tradition?
Jerry, that's very easy. You epitomize one part of the responsibility that is sometimes overlooked of an academic surgeon, in my opinion. The traditional idea that Halsted and others generated in America, and the Germans, certainly the German school, the English school of surgery popularized, made universal, was to train more academic surgeons. I feel that I have just as much pride in having helped in a way to train surgeons who went into community practice, not full-time academic surgery that worked just in the medical schools. But your career epitomizes what a whole generation, whether it's Jim Chandler, whether it's a whole stream, whether it's Bill Pierce, of responsibility in training community surgeons who work not just in university hospitals, don't do bench work, experimental work on animals, but who contribute to progress in surgery in community practice. We went through a period where we were all training people who were going to stay in academic surgery. But you chose to go into community practice, but throughout your entire career, you have maintained a sense of responsibility in community practice in the large number of private hospitals surrounding or not surrounding a university hospital, and also community service. I won't extol the numbers of boards of community service where you are currently contributing, but I was brought up to feel a sense of responsibility, of community responsibility, both within our own profession and as educated people. And you have continued that, and the large number of surgeons that I've helped along in their careers have maintained that. To keep an interest in helping organizations that are as diffuse in my own experience as Colorado Outward Bound, or in creating a system of hut systems, the 10th Mountain huts and trail systems, in which we've created cabins for the general public of cross-country skiers across the state. I'm enormously proud of the 10th Mountain huts and trails system, where the public has low-cost cross-country cabins throughout the Colorado Rockies, similar to the system that we saw in Europe and in Switzerland and in Germany. To have a sense of responsibility to the people we train to the community in which we live. And it's a byproduct, but it's a byproduct that infuses the personality of the people that we help train. Jim Chandler is one of them. Jim has maintained his interest both as an academic surgeon and then in industry. There's nothing conflicting about academic surgery, whether it's vascular or thoracic or cardiac. There's nothing conflicting between the responsibilities of academic surgery military surgery, community surgery, and the role of industry. Now, for various reasons, of course, obviously, the sources of funding for research now, which for various practical reasons have burgeoned, they're multiplied enormously, and to think that government is going to provide all that is a myth. But there's nothing demeaning or compromising in bringing all of these factors together to in the future, in the present, and the future progress of surgery, in my opinion.
Thank you. Now, before I turn this over to Dr. Rich for final comments, I will say that you're giving me $50 in 1956 to travel for 10 days in St. Louis and Chicago.
Yeah, what did you do with what was left over?
I learned how to be frugal. I learned how to hitchhike. I learned how to live in YMCA's. And that was the method at that time. But I also feel so privileged to have been a part of your life and have you be my mentor. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Dr. Eiseman, Ben, you know, this has been a very historic morning for all of us who've been privileged to be with you. We're only sorry that Jim Chandler couldn't stay a little bit longer, but to my knowledge, and we'll have to ask Jimmy Yao, I think this is the first time that we've had multiple people involved, and I think this adds a little bit of additional historical credibility, particularly to have your first resident here sitting with you. You know, this is fantastic. I asked you a little bit earlier about what pleased you the most in your career. I think the recognition that you received last year from the Society of University Surgeons, of which you were president in 1962, was one of the real highlights of your career. And the introduction that Gene Moore did for you, which was fantastic, is online. So that adds another bit of historical credibility to everything that's going on here. But on behalf of Bill Pierce, Jimmy Yao, Jerry Rainier, Jim Chandler, and me, we thank you very much for conducting this interview for our Society for Vascular Surgery.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Norm.
Ben.
I appreciate the honor.